Repression of massive protesters in Quito as Ecuador's president returns to the capital and holds talks with ministers. Turkish military forces arrive at the Syrian border after airstrikes hit Kurdish militia positions in northeast Syria. In Jamaica, 3 high-profile officials, including the former education minister, are arrested on corruption charges. From the headquarters of Telesur English in Quito, Ecuador, this is From the South, and I'm Camila Escalante. We begin in Ecuador, where President Lenin Moreno has returned to the city of Quito, while a massive march by indigenous people and other organizations has been heavily repressed in the city's historic center. Tens of thousands of demonstrators made their way peacefully through the historic center as Ecuador held a national strike against the government's austerity measures. This is the 7th day of protests against the economic package, which is part of President Lenin Moreno's deal with the IMF. In the last 2 days, indigenous marchers have converged on the capital from the north and from the south. They've been joined by students, social movements, and ordinary citizens, angry at the fuel price rises and cuts in workers' rights. As the march moved close to the presidential palace, they were met with tear gas, dispersed by the police. And for the first time since demonstrations began, water cannons were used. Some of the protesters responded with stones. On Tuesday, the government imposed an overnight curfew prohibiting people from being in the vicinity of government buildings. According to authorities, some 700 people, more than 700 people, have been detained so far, and there are reports that at least 2 people have died. Leaders of the main indigenous movement, CONAI, have flatly rejected remarks by Ecuador's Vice President, Otto Sonnenhauser, about possible negotiations. On social media, they said it was untrue that CONAI leaders were in talks with the government at the United Nations office in Ecuador. We are with our members in the streets of the historic center, they said.
Well, I think that austerity policies, the package, el paquete, how it is called here of President Moreno, has, and the state of exception that he has declared has closed down all the ways of a democratic resolution of this conflict. So now the streets of Quito are the only place where people can express their demands and their position, their political positions, because there's no other way to talk here in Ecuador. I mean, this democracy is under threat with President Moreno. That's what is going on now in Ecuador.
Our correspondent Estefania Bravo is in the historic center in Quito with the latest update on the situation.
Hello, we are here in the capital Quito in the city center. It is approximately 3:57 p.m. and as you can see, we are here with various social movements that have come together to the center of Quito to protest against the economic measures of President Lenin Moreno. It is almost 4 p.m. in the afternoon, and people here, I have talked to various people here, and they have told me and they have talked to me and said that this march is not pro any political party. It is against President Lenin Moreno and the economic measures. What we are about to see is the people that are protesting that have taken the streets. The police has repressed violently against these people, and yes, right now we are in the top of a bridge, so we can see the streets very clearly. We are in the center of Quito, and we are expected to see what will happen in the coming hours. We also know that there's a curfew that starts at 8 p.m. local time. So at 8 p.m. local time, people marching, people that are on the streets, will be taken out by the police. The curfew starts at 8 p.m. and it remains until 5 a.m. So we will continue to update you with any information that we think.
Now, a protest against the economic package has also taken place in Ecuador's second city of Guayaquil. The police fired tear gas at this peaceful march as well. President Lenin Moreno moved the government to Guayaquil as the indigenous marchers approached the capital. But indigenous communities from the coastal region have also arrived in Guayaquil to join protests with local social movements.
It affects my own pocket because I have to fill my tank twice a week. Each tank full costs $15 more. That's $30 extra a week. Over the whole year, that's $1,500. That means the health and education of my family, our vacations, and then the civil servants over here who are having 50 days pay taken away. That means they are eliminating the end-of-year bonus salary. People aren't stupid, President Moreno. Please change course. Stop these miseries.
Even though President Moreno returned to Quito, marches continue in the city of Guayaquil. Our correspondent Carla Gonzalez is in Guayaquil with the latest.
The protests continue in downtown Guayaquil. They haven't taken other roads because today both marches against and in favor of the national strike have been going on here in 9 de Octubre Avenue. But for the indigenous march, which is also gathered by campesinos, by students, by artists, they have been met with police repression. We've seen dogs, motorcycles, horses, and a lot of repression by the police for, of course, rounds of tear gas that have also been thrown at protesters. They have not allowed them to enter the main street, the main avenue of the city. Meanwhile, we see on the back that we have the march that was called by the mayor, Cynthia Viteri. The municipal workers are here. They are rejecting what they say is a threat against Guayaquil, because they say that if the indigenous march enters the city, it will create chaos, which coincidentally, the march has entered the city, not in a large number as it did in Quito, but it has entered the city of Guayaquil. And now we are seeing how this march had complete avenues that were open. There wasn't any repression for their part. They were able to walk. There were no tear gas on this side of the road, but on the other one where the indigenous march is happening, they have been met with strong force by police.
We thank Carla for that report. Now, protesters in the Amazonian province of Napo have elected their own indigenous governor. Indigenous organizations and other social movements took over the governor's office in the provincial capital of Tena. They said they were sacking the current governor as a Moreno traitor and held a community assembly to elect a new governor. He is Patricio Sigugango, the president of the Indigenous Federation of Napo. For some discussion on what's been happening in Ecuador, I'm joined now by Canada-based writer with Ecuadorian roots, Joe Emersberger. Good to have you with us, Joe.
Hi, how are you?
Much to talk about, but let's begin with some context into what's been going on. Lenin Moreno was actually the vice president under Correa, who was hugely popular as president and actually left with incredibly high approval rating numbers. Take us back to how we got to where we are now with so much opposition to this current government now.
Right. Well, Moreno ran his 2017 campaign for president as a Correa loyalist, saying nothing but wonderful things about Correa, calling him legendary, the greatest president ever, and all that kind of stuff. And like you said, he had been Correa's vice president for 6 years and then a special envoy to the UN for 4 years. So part of Correa's government for 10 years. So when he said he was going to carry on the same essential policies, people had good reason to believe him. However, within weeks, I'd say 4 to 8 weeks at most of taking office, he showed that he was a complete imposter and that he was going to go 100 degrees against everything that he said he represented. So he immediately started trashing Correa, accusing everybody who he had worked with so closely of corruption. And the way he got away with it was largely due to the fact that the public media and private media were both on the same page. During Correa's time in office, Correa and the public media, they had one point of view, and the private media, they represented the other side. So they were battling each other. But as soon as Moreno got in office, he turned that around completely. And it was just a one-sided media that allowed him to do all sorts of things. And especially a huge part of this is, Moreno has nothing to fear from the courts because he's been able to stack the judiciary to his liking, to the liking of his right-wing allies that he made as soon as he took office. So, when there was somebody expressing disappointment that the Constitutional Court, didn't prevent Moreno from all these repressive measures and state of emergency and all that. Well, how could it when the old constitutional court was fired through this elaborate process that Moreno set up, where he had this hand-picked body by this lengthy acronym, the CPCCST, that basically through them indirectly in some ways, but restacked the judiciary, so that he has nothing to fear from the judiciary, and he basically is not challenged. The judge that goes against him will just get replaced. In fact, 2 judges on the National Criminal Court were just replaced because they made a ruling that Moreno and his allies didn't like. So with that, he's been doing nothing but tax giveaways to the rich. He's refused to borrow internally because that's something that, ideologically the right wing doesn't want the government to borrow internally for itself. They want them to go to the private sector and take out loans at much more expensive rates. They don't want import tariffs, which Correa used, which were crucial to Correa being able to manage, navigate Ecuador's economy in the last 2 years he was in office through the declining oil prices and the shock of the earthquake that they had in April of 2016. So he has refused to do that. So he's done everything that the right wing wants. All the tax giveaways, the cuts in attacking workers' rights, and that. And now with the deal with the IMF, now they've imposed even more stringent conditions, and this is where all his is really the costs are now going to be borne more heavily than ever on the poor in Ecuador, because Ecuador has a dollarized economy. They can't print their own currency, so it's Ecuador. You have to be extremely careful to how to manage the economy properly. And Moreno's his priority has been to just give the rich everything they want. And now that's inevitably going to come with a very harsh austerity measures, and it's going to open question whether he'll be able to survive this and how long.
Discuss the media coverage in Ecuador and around the world, or in this case, the lack thereof. What do you make of the double standard in reporting that we've been seeing?
Well, it's very obvious. I mean, right away, we see articles referring to the protesters as rioters. When protesters take to the streets in Venezuela or something like that, they're never called rioters, no matter what. Even if they do things like burn people in the streets, they're not called rioters. And also, Luis Almagro just put out a statement. Finally, it took him a while because they don't really want to say anything, but he put out a statement and he said he basically didn't say anything about police repression at all. In fact, the only thing he very clearly condemned was any violence or vandalism by protesters. And I mean, that's 180 degrees the opposite of what they do when there's protests in Venezuela, or or there are any protests when Correa was in office. So it's completely different. Human Rights Watch, they're quick to jump on anything that Correa did and accuse him of being repressive. I haven't seen anything from them. I've looked, and they've just kept totally quiet, because they were very big cheerleaders of Moreno's and of the way he stacked the judiciary, the way he wanted it to be, to enable him to do all these things.
Now we have the hugely unpopular President Lenin Moreno teaming up with Venezuelan opposition figure Juan Guaido, trying to place the blame for these huge mass demonstrations on external factors like former President Correa and others in Venezuela. Why this allyship?
Well, that was very. I mean, Moreno even recently says he looks forward to the day when people like Jaime Nebot and Guillermo Lasso are in office as president. He just said that recently. I mean, again, this is people expect very little sincerity from politicians, but even for people who are very cynical about politicians, what Moreno did, his about face, as soon as he took office, the way he just turned, it's just remarkable to see. Yeah, and like you said, he's totally allied with all the right-wing forces in Latin America. And they're all 100% behind him. In fact, 7 of the governments, according to Reuters, just issued a statement against, like you said, Maduro. Trying to blame Maduro for this is just the height of stupidity. I mean, I think Guillermo Lasso takes the prize, though. He said that the Venezuelan, Maduro's using Venezuelan money to finance protests. And everybody knows that Venezuela's going through a brutal economic disaster, in large part, for the past since 2017, because of Trump's really draconian sanctions. So to say that they're using their money to destabilize Ecuador is just the height of stupidity. But again, with this media these people just say whatever they want to say. Like, Moreno, for instance, when he expelled Assange from the embassy in Ecuador, he just told all these outlandish. I mean, anybody with any sense knows that he was lying when he said that Assange was smearing his own feces on the walls and stuff. But when the media wants to believe something, they'll just regurgitate it, and that's kind of been his approach ever since he took office. Just throw any wild allegation against his rivals and let the media back him up on it. But what he's got to now is the point where you can lie to people a lot, but eventually when you start really cutting into their livelihoods, into their ability to make ends meet economically, now media spin can't help you much there. There's reality you have to contend with.
Great insight, Joe. Thank you so much. We've been chatting with Canada-based writer with Ecuadorian roots, Joe Emersberger. You're welcome anytime. Thanks again, Joe. We'll take a short break now. Join us again in a minute. Welcome back. Jamaica's former education minister, Ruel Reid, and his wife, along with president of the Caribbean Maritime University, Fritz Pinnock, have all been arrested. They were held in relation to a corruption probe regarding a multi-million-dollar fraud scheme at the Ministry of Education, CMU, and other government entities which fell under Reid's portfolio as minister. Around 5:30 a.m., police raided their homes in an operation conducted simultaneously in Kingston, St. Catherine, and St. Anne. Reid resigned from government on March 20th, while Pinnock was sent on special leave with immediate effect on Tuesday.
75% of the current.
The data collected from the house-to-house registration process in Guyana is expected to be fully encoded by the Elections Commission, JECOM, by next week, Tuesday. This as the country readies itself for general elections on March 2nd, 2020. GCOM has processed more than 2,000 new registrations over the past week, but the claims and objections process has been ongoing. Going forward, the Chief Elections Officer will prepare a report for a public scrutiny. Claims and objections will end on November 11th. In a case of modern-day slavery was unearthed in Trinidad and Tobago as the police service rescued 69 citizens who were imprisoned at a church in Arauca, East Trinidad. The 65 men and 4 women, some of whom were handcuffed, shared bunk beds in tiny cages and received meals through a small opening. The police commissioner described the rescued people as slaves, adding that their relatives paid for their institutionalization. A total of 6 people have so far been arrested, including the pastor of the so-called Rehabilitation Center for Human Rights Trafficking.
We have now cracked probably what is one of the biggest situations pertaining to human trafficking in this country. We have been liaising with the DPP. There have been 65 men and 4 women that we have found held against their will. They have been in prison. They've been in cages. Some of them have stated that they've been here for a few years. I have contacted the Minister of National Security, the Minister of Health. This is a much bigger picture, and we'll have to investigate each and every situation. 3 people have been held at this time, one being a pastor. He's being questioned. This is on Eastern Main Road in Aruca, and what we've seen is that this relates to virtual slavery, where persons have been in cages. We have reports from some of them that they have been tortured. It is a much bigger picture where there's profit made out of this, and where it involves family members deliberately sending their loved ones here and then trying to extract the profit from the family.
Álvaro Uribe made history on Tuesday, becoming the first former Colombian president to testify before a Supreme Court on allegations including procedural fraud, extortion, and witness tampering that could lead to criminal charges.
A historic event for Colombian justice as the Supreme Court presented its case against ex-president and Senator Álvaro Uribe Vélez. The former leader appeared before Colombia's highest court at 8 a.m. accompanied by his attorneys. he was received by a small group of sympathizers as well as many human rights organizations whose members held photos of victims killed by paramilitaries.
Colombians are celebrating and marking this day of justice. At the same time, we are commemorating our dead, the victims killed specifically during Uribe's tenure between 2002 and 2010. Social leaders, ex-combatants and victims are all present.
In 2012, Uribe sued left-leaning Senator Iván Cepeda, whom he accused of hatching a plot to falsely link him to paramilitary groups. But the court instead opened an investigation into him for procedural fraud, witness tampering, and extortion. Uribe, who is senator and the leader of current President Iván Duque's Democratic Center Party, had to answer about 100 questions as part of the investigation.
As a judge, I voiced my support for the Supreme Court in this brave act because despite all the murderers, Álvaro Uribe was summoned. Even though he was not directly implicated for the massacres, this is the first step because, as a citizen, I have been waiting for this more than half of my life. Justice to be served to one of the biggest criminals in Colombia.
Human rights organizations, social collectives, victims' movements, and teachers' representatives assembled outside the court. They held posters accusing Uribe of mass murder, demanding justice and an explanation of his alleged link to paramilitaries.
We, the Teachers Union, know that Uribe Vélez has a lot to do with the issue of violence in Colombia. In the last 20 years, teachers have been killed simply for educating children on history by showing them how drug trafficking unions work with Colombian politicians and the parapolitical movements that lead to Álvaro Uribe.
This hearing may be extended for several days. The court has a maximum of 10 days to decide whether it will indict Uribe, allowing him to attend court while being free, if the case is closed or if he will be sent to jail.
We'll take a short break now. Join us again after this. Tunisian presidential candidate Nabil Karoui has been released from prison 4 days before the second round of presidential election. Karoui was detained in August before the first round of the election and has spent the entire campaign period in prison pending a verdict in his trial for money laundering and tax evasion. He participated in the just-ended parliamentary election where no clear winner emerged. Polling stations will open for Tunisians for the third time in a month on Sunday for the presidential runoff. The Turkish military has arrived at the Syrian border. The military convoy with war tanks reached Syria and drove along the border crossing into the northern side of the country. This marks the beginning of ground operations after having attacked Kurdish militia positions in northeast Syria with airstrikes and artillery barrages in a cross-border military operation. And all this just days after U.S. troops pulled back from the area. Meanwhile, the Kurdish-led forces said it will not target Turkey but stands ready to face any kind of attack. A spokesman also called on the United Nations, European Union, and democratic countries to oppose the Turkish incursion, saying failure to do so would be an endorsement of the move. Candidates are set to wind up campaigning ahead of the 2019 Canadian federal election to be held on October 21st to elect members of the House of Commons to Parliament as well as Prime Minister. Our correspondent Pablo Vivanco gives us more.
Party leaders continue their campaigning ahead of the October 21st vote, and Justin Trudeau is in the north in Nunavut talking climate change. Conservative leader Andrew Scheer and NDP leader Jagmeet Singh both in the Greater Toronto area. Singh meeting with unions and students, Scheer in the suburbs around the city, hoping to pick up votes in those areas. Now, after Monday's debate, the Conservatives seem to be on track to win a minority government, according to the latest polls. According to those polls that came out after the debate, the Conservatives could be en route to win 152 seats compared to 117 for the Liberals and 36 for the Bloc Québécois. The NDP, for its part, is projecting to win up to 29 seats and 4 for the Greens. Tomorrow will be the last debate that will feature all leaders, and this will be in French.
Thank you, Pablo, for that report. We've come to the end of this news brief. You can find these and many other stories on our website at tellusenglish.net. And join us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. For Tell Us Our English, I'm Camila Escalante. Thanks for watching.